You might think pirates spent most of their time counting treasure and making people walk the plank, but their biggest challenge wasn't avoiding the Royal Navy or fighting sea monsters. It was something much more basic: figuring out where the hell they were in the middle of the ocean. Let me tell you something that might blow your mind about sailing in the 1700s. Ships could carry enough gunpowder to blow up a small town and enough rum to keep a crew drunk for months. But when it came to knowing their exact location, most pirates were basically sailing blind, hoping they'd bump into land before they starved to death. The average pirate captain needed to track his position across thousands of miles of open ocean with nothing but the stars, a compass that probably hadn't been calibrated in years, and whatever scraps of maps they'd stolen from their last raid. Do the math? One wrong calculation and your crew of 50 bloodthirsty pirates becomes 50 very hangry pirates floating around in circles. Here's where things get interesting and kind of terrifying. Some desperate pirates actually tried navigating by taste, literally tasting the water to figure out where they were. Bad idea. Really, really bad idea. Different ocean regions have slightly different salt content and mineral tastes, which sounds scientific until you realize that most pirates had been drinking rum-mixed water for months, and their taste buds were about as reliable as a compass in a thunderstorm. Some pirates learned this the hard way when they followed their tongues straight into Spanish-controlled waters. I once read about a pirate crew that had been sailing for weeks, completely lost, and the captain was so confident in his water-tasting navigation method that he bet his first made a month's share of rum that they were near Jamaica. Spoiler alert, they were actually approaching the Florida Keys, and let's just say that mistake almost got them all killed by very unfriendly Spanish soldiers. Now you'd think someone would have come up with better navigation tools, but remember, this was long before GPS or even accurate clocks. The best they could do was use something called dead reckoning, which sounds ominous and honestly, sometimes was. Dead reckoning meant keeping track of your speed, direction, and time travel to estimate your position. But here's the problem. Ocean currents, wind changes, and the rolling motion of the ship meant that even the most careful calculations could be off by hundreds of miles. The name dead reckoning supposedly comes from deduced reckoning, but many pirates joked it was called that because bad reckoning could leave you dead. The navigation situation got so bad sometimes that pirates would completely change their planned raids just because they spotted land, any land. Imagine being the most feared pirates in the Caribbean but having to abandon your attack on a Spanish treasure galleon because you're not sure if you're looking at Cuba or some random sandbar. Speaking of getting lost, there's a lesser-known story about the infamous Captain Bartholomew Roberts. Everyone knows him as Blackbeard, the pirate who captured over 400 ships, but what most don't know is that he was actually terrible at navigation. He got around this by specifically targeting ships that carried skilled navigators along with their cargo. Smart guy, right? When things got really desperate, pirates had to turn to their most unreliable backup plan: following other ships. And trust me, when you saw another sail on the horizon, you'd never see a crew argue faster about whether to follow it or attack it. The moment another ship appeared, the entire pirate crew would transform into amateur detectives trying to figure out where that ship was heading. The deck became busier than a tavern on payday night. Pirates actually had a whole system worked out for ship-following navigation. The lookouts, those guys who spent all day in the crow's nest getting seasick, became the most important people on the ship. They'd watch other vessels for hours, trying to figure out their heading and destination. Sometimes they'd follow merchant ships for days, staying just far enough away to avoid suspicion but close enough to use them as a guide. You'd see experienced pirates adjusting their course based on the smallest changes in another ship's direction, creating what they called shadow sailing. The clever part was how they used different types of ships as navigational clues. Fishing boats usually stayed close to shore, so following them meant land was nearby. Spanish treasure ships followed specific routes between colonies, so spotting one could tell you exactly which trade route you were on. But it wasn't all smooth sailing, pun totally intended. Ship-following navigation came with its own set of problems. First off, the ship you were following might be just as lost as you were. Smart pirates would wait to see multiple ships heading in the same direction before trusting their course. Here's a funny detail most history books don't mention. During foggy weather, you'd see pirates trying to follow other ships by sound alone. They'd listen for creaking rigging, splashing waves, and shouting sailors, trying to stay close without actually seeing where they were going. Some would even lower small boats to get closer to ships they were following, hoping to overhear conversations about their destination. One account from a Dutch merchant describes watching pirates rowing alongside his ship in thick fog, pretending to be fishermen while obviously eavesdropping on the crew's discussion about their next port. But you couldn't always count on other ships. Sometimes pirates would go days without seeing another sail on the horizon. That's when they got really creative with their celestial navigation techniques. They had strict rules about star-watching duties, even stricter than the rules about dividing treasure. Breaking the navigation watch could get you in more trouble than stealing from the ship's rum supply. There's this great story about a pirate ship called the Vengeful Serpent where the crew became so skilled at reading stars that they could predict weather changes 3 days in advance. They celebrated by having a star feast, where everyone got an extra ration of hardtack, which might not sound like much of a party to us today. But back then it was better than finding a chest full of silver. The really skilled pirate navigators could even use seabirds as direction finders. Different birds flew in predictable patterns relative to land, and experienced pirates could tell you exactly how far from shore you were based on which birds were following the ship. Makes you wonder if some of those fearsome pirates were really just expert birdwatchers with a side hustle in robbery. But even with all these clever navigation tricks, there were still times when the stars were hidden and no other ships were in sight. That's when pirates had to turn to their most desperate backup plan: coastal navigation. When the compass started spinning and the stars disappeared behind clouds, pirates had to become expert land readers. Forget treasure maps. The most valuable knowledge in a pirate's head was knowing how different coastlines looked from the water. These coastal navigation skills were kept more secret than buried treasure locations, and for good reason. Knowing how to identify a safe harbor could mean the difference between successful raids and ending up on the wrong end of a naval cannon. The first trick every pirate navigator learned was to look for distinctive landmarks. Sounds obvious, right? But there's more to it than just spotting the nearest mountain. Pirates figured out that certain combinations of land features were better position markers than others. A single tall hill might be visible from dozens of different locations, making it pretty useless for pinpointing exactly where you were. But a tall hill next to a distinctive rock formation near a river mouth, that's navigational gold right there. Some clever pirates even learned to identify different types of sand on beaches. Black volcanic sand meant you were near certain Caribbean islands, while white coral sand indicated others. Pirates became experts at reading the color and texture of shorelines like a book. Here's where it gets interesting. Pirates developed their own system of coastal landmarks that they'd share only with trusted crew members. They'd give weird names to geographical features: Dead Man's Nose for a pointed cliff, or Mermaid's Hair for a waterfall that looked like flowing locks from a distance. These landmark names were often inside jokes or references to previous adventures. One pirate map I've seen had a bay labeled "Where Jenkins Lost His Pants," which probably has a hilarious story behind it that we'll never know. But my favorite coastal navigation technique has to be what I call the smoke trick. Pirates would look for cooking fires from coastal settlements, especially in the early morning or evening when smoke was most visible. Different communities had different patterns of when and where they'd light fires. Spanish settlements typically had very organized smoke patterns. Fires would appear at specific times as people cooked meals. English colonies were more random, and indigenous communities had their own distinctive fire schedules that experienced pirates learned to recognize. One pirate captain wrote in his journal that he could identify which type of settlement he was approaching just by watching the smoke patterns. Though he complained that on windy days the smoke would blow around so much it was like trying to read a book during a hurricane. Sometimes pirates got really creative and used the behavior of sea life as navigation aids. Dolphins often played in the bow waves of ships heading toward their feeding grounds near specific reefs or bays. Following dolphins wasn't just fun, it was actually practical navigation. There's a funny story about a pirate crew that followed a pod of dolphins for 2 days, convinced they were being led to a secret bay full of treasure. Turns out the dolphins were just playing, and the pirates ended up at a completely random stretch of coastline where the only treasure was a very confused hermit crab. The really skilled coastal navigators learned to read ocean swells, those long, rolling waves that travel for miles across open water. When swells hit coastlines, They bounce back in predictable patterns. Experienced pirates could feel these wave patterns through the ship's hull and use them to estimate their distance and direction from land, even in complete darkness. Some pirates actually claimed they could navigate by smell. Coastal areas have distinctive scents: flowering trees, rotting seaweed, smoke from settlements, even different types of mud. While this might sound like nonsense, anyone who's spent time at sea knows that your senses become incredibly sharp when your life depends on them. One of the cleverest techniques I've heard about was using the color of water as a navigation aid. Shallow water near coastlines has a different color than deep ocean water, and experienced pirates learned to read these color changes like a depth chart. Blue-green water usually meant coral reefs, brown water indicated muddy river outflows, and that perfect Caribbean blue meant deep, clear water far from land. Pirates who mastered this technique could estimate their distance from shore just by looking over the side of the ship. But finding the coast was only half the battle. Once pirates spotted land, they needed to figure out exactly where they were and whether it was safe to approach. And those decisions could mean the difference between a successful resupply and a very short career. The biggest challenge wasn't actually spotting land, it was identifying which land they'd found. In the Caribbean, many islands look remarkably similar from a distance, and making the wrong choice could lead you straight into a heavily fortified Spanish port instead of the friendly pirate haven you were looking for. Pirates developed elaborate systems for identifying specific islands and coastlines. They'd create detailed drawings of how different locations looked from various distances and angles, noting distinctive features like rock formations, tree lines, and building silhouettes. These identification guides were treated like sacred texts. A good set of coastal recognition drawings could be worth more than a ship's entire treasure haul, because knowing exactly where you were could save your entire crew from sailing into a trap. The real experts could identify their location by combining multiple factors: the shape of the coastline, the color of the water, the types of birds flying overhead, the direction of ocean swells, and even the smell of the air. It was like being a detective, except instead of solving crimes, you were solving the mystery of your own location. One of the most valuable skills a pirate navigator could have was recognizing safe versus dangerous harbors from a distance. Spanish military ports had different characteristics than merchant harbors, which looked different from pirate-friendly hideouts. Military ports usually had visible fortifications, organized ship arrangements, and flag signals. Merchant harbors showed lots of cargo activity and civilian vessels. Pirate havens were often hidden in natural harbors with quick escape routes and lookout points. There's this fascinating account from a Spanish naval officer who described watching a pirate ship approach his port. The pirate spent hours just outside the harbor, clearly studying the layout and trying to identify what kind of port it was before deciding whether to attack or flee. Smart pirates would send small boats ahead to scout harbors before bringing their main ship close to shore. These scouting missions were incredibly dangerous. If they were caught, the scouts would likely be executed as spies. But the information they gathered could save the entire crew from sailing into a deadly trap. The most successful pirate navigators kept detailed journals of every coastline they'd ever seen. These journals included sketches, written descriptions, notes about currents and winds, and most importantly, information about which locations were friendly and which were hostile. Some of these navigation journals have survived to this day, and they're incredible documents. They show just how sophisticated pirate navigation actually was, despite what Hollywood movies might have you believe. But even with all these coastal navigation skills, landmark recognition, watercolor reading, smoke watching, and harbor identification, pirates still faced their biggest navigation challenge of all: staying alive long enough to use what they'd learned. Because in the end, the most important navigation skill wasn't reading stars or following birds or identifying coastlines. It was knowing when to run, when to fight, and when to disappear into the maze of Caribbean islands before anyone could catch you. And that, my friends, is what separated the successful pirates from the ones who ended up decorating the entrances to colonial ports.